Hey everybody, Brendan here. Welcome back to another tournament game analysis video. Today we're going to be covering round 4 of a February tournament I played in 2023, last year. Now it is time to play against Max. Alright, so I ended up playing e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5. This is just the Ruy Lopez normal opening. a6, and bishop to a4 is kind of like, just the standard move, trying to keep pressure on this knight here and putting some pressure also on the e5 pawn indirectly. One good way to think about a move like bishop to b5 is it is controlling the center. It doesn't look like it is because it's controlling or looking at these squares, but it's indirectly controlling it because it's also putting pressure on the knight, which is controlling the center, because you're always threatening to remove their control. Therefore, it's an influence of it. Anyways, knight to f6 and d3. So, admitting something, I was definitely using the Grandelius course here. That's available on Chessable, the Grand Ruy Lopez. And these d3 positions definitely popped out as a pretty important thing to look at. But my prep here wasn't something that was completely in my mind at the time. Like, it was kind of like a passing thing where I was looking at the course, but I definitely could have gotten a little bit more out of it. Just like looking at uh, the course in finer detail and seeing what to do against certain variations. Of course, my opponent played b5 here, early b5, just making sure that there's no problem with bishop takes on c6. Another good alternative that I quite like is bishop to c5. The whole point is you're not actually threatening this pawn because of this move queen to d4, threatening checkmate and the knight. So that would actually lose a piece. So b5 instead, though, bishop to b3, bishop to c5, and I end up castling here. So yeah, still pretty standard. And at this point, I was kind of out of prep, but it's, the Ruy Lopez, once you play these types of positions, they all kind of look not the same, but you can play a lot of them in very similar ways. For example, bringing the rook to e1, bringing this knight over to g3, bringing this bishop either to e3, maybe even to g5. Obviously playing for c3, d4, also looking at a4 and h3. These types of moves are all kind of thematic, almost regardless of how you're playing against or what type of specific setups your opponents are trying to throw at you. So turns out bishop g5 is actually quite a strong move, and I recalled something like this in the game, but I couldn't make sense of it because I just wasn't happy with any knight a5s. For example, bishop g5, knight a5, even if this doesn't actually work out, I just didn't want to enter these types of complications because, of course, when you're playing the Ruy Lopez, the light square bishop is everything. If you lose it for the knight, then black has, honestly, the easier game. So I played c3. Now knight a5 can always be met with bishop c2. Pretty standard move. Bishop to b6 was played, just getting, out of the c pawn and also getting out of any d4, hitting the bishop with tempo. a4. Bishop to d7, just so if I end up taking on b5, they can just recapture with the queen. This is the whole point here, because the pawn was pinned before. But of course, we just leave it, because we're never really scared of them taking. Because after bishop takes on a4, what we can see here is that our bishop is excellent, and their pawn structure is a bit damaged. On the queen side and the center specifically, they just have more pawn islands than us. Technically, we only have one if we count from all the way from b2 to h2, but they unfortunately have two, all the way from c7 to h7, but also this a6 pawn, which is also isolated, and definitely can prove to be a weakness. So white would definitely have an advantage there. They end up castling, because of course they're not going to do something like that. Rook to e1, knight to a5, and bishop to c2, c5. And I was considering d4 here, but I ended up just slow playing it with knight to f1, h6, and knight g3. Max ended up bringing back his knight to c6. There's always ideas of knight e7 to g6. But also it's just nice here, especially if you're going to go for some sort of d5 break. The knight is now centralized. It did its task of getting out of the way of the c pawn to be able to push it. The c pawn is now on c5 instead. So knight c6 is a very logical move. I play h3 just to prevent bishop g4 because I'm trying to get d4, but I don't want to allow bishop to g4 as a response. Rook to e8. And yeah, I kind of slow play here with the move bishop to d2. It's kind of hard to suggest a move here because, for example, d4, it just doesn't really work out. After knight takes d4, and bishop takes d4, we're just down a pawn. So we can't really go down this route here. So yeah, bishop to d2, but it's hard to suggest other potential moves. There is taking on b5, takes, and rook takes, and maybe something like bishop to e3 going for d4, just trying to say that maybe this queen's a little offside. But I kind of doubt that that's actually anything so serious. So all of a sudden, yeah, we're not really getting into the positions we want here, and I was a little uncomfortable. But bishop d2 is one of these normal developing moves as well. Instead of going to e3, where all of a sudden d4 is harder to play because e4 might be weakened, and of course bishop g5 is off the table, where else does it go? So d5, and I tried this move queen to c1, and yeah, this couldn't be more obvious, but sometimes that's all you need. There's definitely threats here of taking on h6, and I think that does actually have to be respected. D takes was played, and let's just say they play something a little slow here. Yeah, I think you can probably just consider this sacrifice. And this specific variation I didn't actually calculate out. But just looking at the moves knight h4 to f5, make it quite worthwhile, even if it doesn't end up working out. This is very, very serious and definitely needs to be considered. So yeah, these things are always on the horizon. So yeah, knight to h7 was played. And the whole point is now, if we end up taking on h6 here, queen takes, there's queen f6. And all of a sudden, this is a very annoying way for black to play. Black can force the trade of queens, or if we retreat back, then, well, their queen is quite active, defending a lot of key squares. Their knight is actually very well placed. It might look a little silly because it's on h7, but it's controlling a lot of important key squares. f6, g5, f8, where it can eventually go to, maybe go to g6, and then to f4. Yeah, lots of different ways to play here. So this would just not be a good move at all. I end up taking on b5, rook takes a8, and queen takes a8. And yeah, I was pretty happy here because, again, it just feels so close that something like bishop h6 was working, but I couldn't really make it out, unfortunately. So yeah, didn't go for that. Instead, I went for knight h4, which I think was fine. Trying to go for the f5 square, knight to e7, and I spent about 10 minutes on my next move here. I think it was a decent amount of time, so I don't feel too bad about this, because I think this was a critical decision, but I don't think I came up with the right answer here. I played bishop to e3, trying to go for potential b4, and I'm trying to play against this bishop on b6, but there's actually a stronger way to do that I didn't even consider, and that's actually the move c4. It does the exact same thing, and yeah, they don't really want to take the pawn, they don't really want to push either, and this bishop on b6 just is out of the game completely now. For example, maybe queen c6 gets played, and then bishop to c3. This is a really clever idea, because now it's asking for some sort of b4, but it doesn't quite work, and we're attacking the e5 pawn. And how do they kind of deal with this? If they play something like f6, that's quite weakening, and if they defend it with their queen, for example, then maybe we could even consider either taking on b5 or playing b3, where the bishop actually can go to b2 and stay on this long diagonal. So a bunch of interesting options here, I think. Yeah, but I didn't unfortunately play this. Bishop to e3 was played, which is not even close to as good. Queen to c6. bishop to d1, just trying to reroute to g4. I thought this might be a good idea, trying to remove some defenders of this f5 square, but this really did not work out in the long run. Bishop to g4, knight to f6, taking on d7, knight takes d7, knight h to f5, knight takes f5, knight takes f5, bishop takes e3, queen takes e3, and knight c5. And this is where I'm just actually pretty much panicking, because when you see this knight on c5, you see it going to d3, and you're like, oh, I have a weakness on b2. This is a big problem. But yeah, I wasn't really sure what to do. I ended up playing f3 here. It turns out there's this really interesting option of rook to a1. And the whole point is queen takes e4. You can actually just take on h6. You throw this move in, and then you can take on c5 because this knight is hanging. You don't want to take first, because when they take on f5, they're up a pawn. We could take on b5, but giving them the kingside majority, I don't think is appropriate there. And then also, if knight takes e4, really interesting, we could just play queen f3. And this is actually kind of a problem, where now we have threats, for example, of knight g3, just winning the piece pretty much, or, you know, provoking f5, where we can take that and then threaten knight g3 all the same. So queen b7 is a good way to deal with this. Rook to e1 as well. And after this, knight c5, and we go queen g3 instead. So we've pretty much provoked black a little bit backwards, and then after f6, instead of going for h6, we can just play knight to d6, because we were threatening both mate and an exchange there with this fork. Really, really hard to see this idea of rook a1, though. I think f3 is pretty human, but yeah, it starts getting a little rough here. So king h7 was a nice move. Again, yeah, it really sucks that I can't just play something like queen g3 here, but that's how it is. So rook to d1, knight to d3, and I played b3. I thought this was the right call, because of course now they can't take, and maybe I can take on c4, but yeah, even though this pawn on b2 is weak, I really should not have been trying this. Instead, the move queen a7 is much stronger, and it's pretty much just saying that, yeah, we got the open file, we're threatening to take on f7 as well, and you can't take on b2 because of rook d6, which is quite nice, where after queen c8, queen f7, there's rook h6 threats, queen g7 threats, and yeah, this is just the way to go. And yeah, I was just too focused on defense instead of looking for active defense, which is offense. So b3, queen g6, and now knight f4 is coming, as you can see, which is not pleasant. I played h4 just to make sure that when knight f4 comes, then there's not actually a threat on winning a pawn. It's just threatening mate, so I can just deal with that with like rook d2 or queen f2 or something. Or not queen f2, because knight h3 check, so important. Don't play this move because of knight h3. That would be really bad, but you get the point. Something like even like rook d2. But here, rook a8 was played, so they get the open file. Things are getting pretty rough. I take on c4, take on c4, and I go rook b1, trying to get activity. But at this point, I already knew that things were really bad. So rook a2, g3, and queen a6. And yeah, I just knew that this was pretty much lost at this point. I was also hoping for some sort of like rook b6 action. But the problem is rook a1, and after king g2, queen a2, king h3, there's knight f2, and this just wins the house after king g2 and knight g4. So I knew that this wouldn't work, so I tried f4, just trying to make things a little bit more messy. But yeah, this was already resignable, and actually after queen a4, I decided to just flat out resign, because queen c2 is coming, and the second rank is so unbelievably weak that there's nothing to do. I'm just going to lose quite quickly to checkmate, or just losing a mass amount of material, and then probably get checkmated anyways. So, yeah, still pretty good event so far. I am on an even score now, because I did beat a 2000. I just lost to Max, and the other two games were pretty fighting draws, which was not actually a bad thing at all. They were much higher rated than me, so Can't really complain about that. Now after this one, um, it actually didn't like hurt too much losing a game like this, just because when you are playing against someone so much stronger, and you don't really study your openings enough in a kind of like an effective way, where you you know it was early enough or early on enough where maybe I should have known a little bit more than I did, and maybe that would have helped me out. But yeah, too little, too late. But overall, yeah, that's in my opinion, a pretty decent game. So yeah, I guess I will see you all for the final round of this February tournament, and it's kind of an interesting one. So yeah, I'll see you there. All right, bye bye.